performing God's will in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, excellent point. All right, so next topic that everyone lost their collective minds over this last weekend was Disney came out. I'm going to show you guys a video here in a second. It's actually a clip of two separate videos that came out that were kind of leaked. Was basically Disney executives getting together talking about sort of the direction of the company, what's happening with the company as far as Disney in general, parks, movies, that sort of thing. I know a few weeks ago when the movie Red came out, there was a lot of blogs came out, a lot of statements came out about that movie. And then these videos that I'm going to show you came out and everybody kind of was like, as well. So let's watch them and then we can talk a little bit about Disney because Matt, you just recently got back from Disney. So you can kind of tell us the mood there. So let's watch this real quick, guys, and then we will get right to it.
Disney's content. I grew up watching, all of the classics. They have been a huge, informative part of my life. But at the same time, I worked at small studios most of my career, and I'd heard, you hear whispers. I'd heard things like, they won't let you show this at a Disney show. And I'm like, okay. So I was a little sus when I started. But then my experience was bafflingly the opposite of what I had heard on my little pocket of proud family Disney TVA. The showrunners were super welcoming. Meredith Roberts and our leadership over there has been so welcoming to my not at all secret gay agenda. And so I feel I felt it was, maybe it was that way in the past, but I guess something must have happened in the last they are turning it around, they're going hard. And then all that momentum that I felt, that sense of I don't have to be afraid to let's have these two characters kiss, let's in the background I was just wherever I could just basically adding queerness to if you see anything queer in the show, I'm proud family. But I just was no one would stop me and no one was trying to stop me.
Gendered greetings in relationship to our live spiels. So we no longer say ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We've provided training for all of our cast members in relationship to that. So now they know it's hello everyone or hello friends. We are in the process of changing over those recorded messages. And so many of you are probably familiar when we brought the fireworks back to the Magic Kingdom. We no longer say ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we say dreamers of all ages. And so I love the fact that it's opened up the creativity, the opportunity for our cast members to look at that. We have our cast members working with merchandise, working with food and beverage, working with all of our guest facing areas where perhaps, we want to create that magical moment with our cast members, with our guests. And we don't want to just assume because someone might be in our interpretation, maybe presenting as female, that they may not want to be called princess. So let's think.
Okay, so some of that went through. It looks pods out. That's exactly what the problem was. So those videos leaked. That came across. Everyone lost their mind for a couple reasons, right? So you guys probably heard the first video when she said my not so secret gay agenda. That kind of really was a trigger point, I think, for a lot of people. And then the second video wasn't so much controversial as much as it was the idea of saying, genderless in the announcements, genderless in a lot of ways that they address guests, things like that. Now, I know you were just there that you said, did you notice any of this? Did you sort of see a tone, a tenor of what was going on in the park, maybe just from being there?
Yeah, so nobody fall out with me. Last week I actually did take a pilgrimage to Orlando and pay homage to the giant rat. So I'll go ahead and clear my conscience on that. Specifically to go to Hollywood Studios and Galaxy's Edge to have the Star Wars experience, and so to feed my inner nerd. But I had been there a couple of times before in years past. And one of the things that stood out to me that I thought was very strange was the general demeanor of the employees, the cast members, as they call them. And what was really odd is that in years prior, so one of the incentives of going to Disney World, Disneyland, where whichever one people attended. It was sort of like, the magical experience and the atmosphere where like everybody is, everybody's enjoying themselves. All of the cast members, the employees are all very warm, open, welcoming. But things were very different this time around. Like, I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was the recent return from COVID, the extreme influx of spring breakers and people on vacation, like flooding into the parks, and like, people weren't used to it, new employees, whatever it was. But everybody was very solemn. Everything was toned down. Some people were just like downright rude. And I mean, we're all people and everybody's allowed to be rude, but it wasn't just one or two people or specific incidents, but it was like the vast majority of the employees were just really off. And I don't know if it's because just a few days prior to my going was when there was like the whole mass walkout of employees. And so I don't know if behind the scenes, like as far as logistics and human resources were concerned, there's this big crunch on the expectations of employees and everybody trying to pick up the pace, pick up the slack or whatever. But it was just a very strange experience, and it really stuck out to me. And I'm not by nature like a complainer, but this was it was just something that was very obvious to me. In connection to this whole concept, I do think that it's ironic that they're putting so much effort into using gender neutral language for fear of offending or leaving someone out by using a gender specific language. And yet, like, all of the bathrooms are still labeled, as men and women, male and female. And so like it's sort of like the whole saying of they're choking on gnats and swallowing camels. Like trying to put forth all of this effort into just these insignificant greetings and words, but there is still the practical common sense separation of the bathrooms. So I just sort of see all of that as redundant in terms of the way that the parks are still set up.
So on that note, a lot of what happened after this, right? So that's an interesting view into the park as far as what's going on there, as far as kind of mood, I suppose. And I didn't connect the fact that you had went like right after that whole walkout thing happened. But what I did see is a lot of people talking about boycotting Disney, counseling Disney Plus, not supporting their shows, that sort of thing. What I got my take on that, but before I say my take on that, what is sort of your, because I know, I mean, we're coming from sort of two different points as far as I got kids, you don't, where do you think that kind of, from your perspective, what's your whole take on the canceling Disney, the go woke, go broke thing?
I think that if that is your personal conviction and that is something that is set in your mind and in your heart, and you think that is best for you personally, is best for you spiritually, and also your way of trying to impact the culture and society and making your voice heard, then I think that's great. Then you should follow your conscience, because whatever is not of faith is of sin. And so if that's something that you feel is right, then you should, I think that you should absolutely pursue that. As far as turning it into a source of like virtue signaling and trying to force this upon other believers and making broad statements, as in like, oh, well, if you still have Disney Plus, or that you still associate with anything like that, then you're ruining your Christian witness, or whatever the reasoning may be. I think that that's very shaky ground, because if we really want to go down that path, we'll eventually end up in an Amish community, because literally we live in a fallen, broken, horrible, terrible society. And if we're going to handle these situations even-handedly and circumspectly, then you're going to have to reevaluate everything and everywhere that your money is both willingly and involuntarily going. And if you go down that road, you're going to have to go all the way. And it is possible. I mean, that's why the Amish still live as in the way that they do, is because they want to be totally separate from the culture and the influence of the world. They want to live being to support themselves, and it just be them and their Amish Christian community and God. And hey, I mean, there's plenty of times when me and actually the rest of my family have talked, like, we're just ready to go and like go up in the mountains somewhere and become totally self-sufficient and like not have any kind of human interaction, but just live out there until the Lord comes or we go to Him. So I think that if that is your personal conviction, then you should go for it. I mean, I'm not going to try to talk you out of it.
Yeah. No, me and my wife have definitely had a similar conversation of, hey, there's some woods over there. Let's just go live in there and just cut everything off. So on that note, I actually had this conversation because of a tweet I made the other day with some of the guys in the Patreon chat about like, where do you go? Because again, like you said, like I think it becomes this, to be consistent, you would almost have to go to the extreme, right? So to cut off Disney is one thing, but Disney is owned by ABC or owns ABC. I'm not sure which direction that goes. And ABC has their hands in almost everything. And one of the things that you have to consider is like, where is it going? So one of the things that like me and my wife have talked about, right? So we got rid of Netflix whenever the whole cuties thing happened. And we were like, I personally don't feel comfortable paying that. Not only on that, but it was one of those things where I was like, there's a slew of other shows that just aren't beneficial, not only for me, but so why am I paying that, them to do that? And then when this came around, we were like, it's the same conversation. We're like, why do we have this too then? Because we have 2 kids, and the more, what we often do is we'll sit down and we'll watch a show with them. And then as those things come up in the show, basically at this point, as far as I can tell as a parent, you're basically having to walk through and disciple your children as you're watching shows anymore, as far as, hey, this, they believe this, but this is how we see it through a Christian lens. They do this, but we, don't believe. And there's some points, obviously, there's some shows you don't do that on. You just don't watch them. But there is a lot, especially with that first quote from that lady that was on the video about her not so secret gay agenda. I think, here's the thing. I think parents would be incredibly surprised at how much I would call it propaganda is in shows that they are just blatantly not aware of. There are a number of Disney shows that have just flat out blatant references within them, not making that the main thing, but it's just sort of there as a normalizing of that whole thought process. So that if you're not aware of that and you are letting your kids watch that and you're not having those discussions, I think there would be a number of parents that would be really surprised. There was one show in particular that I was surprised about that I didn't even know until afterwards. I don't think it's a Disney show. It was actually back when we had Netflix, but it was She-Ra. She-Ra has a whole lesbian theme in that show specifically that's written into it.
Is that the He-Man spinoff?
It's they modernized it. So I guess back in the 80s it was He-Man and She-Ra, and then Netflix sort of spun the show out as its own newer series, and that whole series has that built in. And again, you wouldn't know it unless you were to sit down and watch every episode. And it's one of those things that I think as parents we just need to be. If you are going to have some of these services, again, like I would agree with you, it's your own conscience. But one of the things I think as a parent that you have to be aware of is that what you're allowing your kids to watch probably isn't at par of what you think they are watching. You think it's a cartoon. You don't think it's that harmful. You don't think it's that bad. Even me and my wife talk a lot about, there's a Gumball is some silly show. I don't know if it's on Disney or Nickelodeon, but like the dad is a complete moron. Like he does not know how to tie his own shoes. And a lot of those shows are sort of the same sort of thing. Again, they're just building in this thought process of telling your kids how to think about things, even if it's subtle. And you just have to be aware of that. So when this whole thing came out with Disney, and the more I've seen with that sort of happening within their shows, we were like, yeah, we don't need that. I would rather spend my money somewhere else, and not pay some company to freely propagandize my children against the very things that I'm trying to teach them. Now, with that being said, I think there is something to be said about you're not going to be able to put your kids in a bubble. It's just not going to happen. You may be able to put them in a bubble for a little amount of time, but eventually they're going to go out into the world. And I think that's where, like, as you have them, as these topics come up, right? I forget the verse exactly, but it's the whole, as you walk by the way, I think it's Deuteronomy, as you live life, you are explaining to your children the ways of God, right? There are going to be things that you naturally come upon that you're going to have that discussion about. So yes, don't deliberately put things in front of your kids' faces that are against what we believe as believers. But don't assume that by not doing that, you just get out of that conversation because you're not going to get out of the conversation. You can homeschool them. You can have all the television taken away, but eventually they're going to go out to the world, and you need to have them trained up. You need to have them discipled. You need to have those conversations. And I think some parents, I think it was sort of maybe our parents' generation for sure had this idea of, if I just don't have this thing around here, it's not an issue and I don't have to have the discussion. But then we all went out into the world and we're like, oh, this is a big place. And then because you weren't prepared for it, you had to figure it out. So like now, I think the wake-up call for parents and a lot of people I talk to is that, yeah, you don't deliberately put in front of their faces, but the reality is sin is out there. You're going to have to explain to them how to deal with it and how to recognize it and how to discern it. I tell my daughter all the time, like, I don't want you to have a clone mind of my brain, but I do want you to use your brain and to figure out how, when people are trying to sell you things and when they're trying to teach you things, because everyone is. So use your brain and discern those things. And I think that's where it really comes down to. You could blanket and be like, we're going to not have anything. Well, okay, fine. But you're still going to go to the grocery store. Your kids are still going to interact with their friends. Eventually, they're going to come up to a transgender individual or somebody from the LGBTQ plus community, and they're going to have to know how to interact and what they believe. So taking away Disney doesn't solve that problem. Though I would argue,
I think that this the complexities of this situation we may think is unique to our age. But throughout history, and even throughout Christian history, this has been a repeated phenomenon, because I think of Christianity in its infancy, as it is leaving Israel Palestine area and spreading out through the world, specifically into Asia Minor and Greece and what was in Rome. People would have, specifically the Greeks and even the Jews living in Greek society, would have been incredibly immersed in these very same types of the same type of social cultural propaganda. I would even go so far to say that it was worse, because at least in the modern world, as of right now, things like prostitution is still illegal. When we walk down the street, at least in America and most of the Western world, there are churches on every street instead of all of these temples and shrines and so on and so forth. And you see this coalesce in the situation that Paul addresses in Corinth with the concept of meat sacrificed to idols. And the argument was from the people who said, no, you have to abstain. You can't eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols. Actually, follows the initial advice given by the apostles in like the first council of Jerusalem, when Peter and James are there, and James is like, hey, let's not put any more on these Greeks, and they have to, but let's just basically give them the Jewish cultural basics of how to live a godly life. And one of those things was to abstain from blood and to not eat meat that's sacrificed to idols. But then you have Paul over here telling the Corinthians, like, if it doesn't bother your conscience, then it's okay. And if it does bother your conscience, then just don't do it. Now, Paul could have said, no, it's horrible. It's terrible to eat meat sacrificed to idols. You are just going to have to work and search through the marketplaces until you find meat that is not sacrificed to idols. And then that is the only meat that you can buy. But that's not what he tells them. He gives them the solution by jumping through a lot of a good critical process of hermeneutics and practical pastoral application in coming to a solution. And I think that is at least analogous to the current situation, which I know that in the current situation is about completely voluntary entertainment, whereas Paul was addressing sustenance for life being food. But you can at least you can go to those extremes. You could say, well, they didn't have to eat meat, or well, they could have at least searched for meat that hadn't been sacrificed to idols. They could have went out and raised their own meat, or went to a specifically Jewish market. But that's not the kind of legalistic, black and white, cookie cutter, copy and paste answer that Paul gives.
Yeah. So real quick, I know we do. I want to touch. We don't have a lot of time left, but I know we definitely want to get to the abortion thing. But real quick, I've got one line, and then F, do you want to answer this question with kind of a real short answer? Victoria asked, "How do we teach them being our kids, how to critically think through these things?" And my quick answer would be this: to teach them by watching us, right? So one of the best ways that I found to do that is just show that, like, I'm critically thinking through things. So when something comes up, a controversial topic on the television, and we start having a discussion, it's not necessary for me to talk through all the steps of my thought process, but I do that so that, they can sort of hear that process. So my answer to that, really quick and simple, would be just by watching us. That would be the simplest way. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another commenter provided a resource here. I'm not familiar with it, but it looks like Hannah says that a good book is Mama Bear Apologetics. So that may be something that viewers can look into. And I think the Victoria actually had just responded to Hannah there.
Yeah.
But I think that as far as critical thinking, as you said, definitely to provide that kind of parental example for them to follow. But I think that good, honest, open, direct, age-appropriate conversations with your children, and also maturity-appropriate conversations with your children about a variety of topics that they are going to have to face into the world is necessary. The quick way out is, well, because I said so, or well, because that's just the way that it is. Like that's more of an excuse than a reason. Like, critical thinking is taking the available evidence, the available facts, our experiences, bringing them together into conversation, and then coming to an appropriate solution with that. And so teaching kids to think that way, especially in the younger years, will only compound and allow them, hopefully, to surpass you in terms of their success, in terms of their godliness and their devotion. Because what parent doesn't want their children and their grandchildren and so forth to have better experiences, to do better, to go beyond what they themselves have.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like that that aphorism: if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. But if you teach a man to fish, I'm sorry, well, are we supposed to use non-gender inclusive language? Give a person.
We're still good here. We're
give
good.
a person a fish, and the person will eat for a day. But you teach a man to fish, and he'll eat for a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of that concept. I personally prefer the aphorism that, if you build a man a fire, he'll be warm for a while. If you push the man into the fire, he'll be warm for the rest of his life.
Which is going to be very short. Okay. Also, apparently, there's also a Mama Bear Apologetics podcast as well. If you guys want to check that out, I don't know anything about it, but there you go. So.